One thing that you ultimately can't avoid in today's day and age is disappointment. Oh, yeah, Payday, right. If you are enthusiastic about something, your expectations about this product, franchise, or series will naturally steadily increase. If you love music and your favorite artist releases a new song which you simply do not vibe with, you'll end up disappointed. If you love art and your favorite niche artist drew something outside of the niche you initially followed them for, there's a chance you'll at least be a little disappointed. If you love movies, and your favorite movie just got a terrible live-action remake or a horrible sequel that feels like a cash-in, you'll be disappointed. If you love games, and your favorite developer made a sequel to one of your favorite games of all time, only for it to feel nothing like its predecessors outside of the theming and the name, look, you get the idea by now. Intro aside, time for a little disclaimer. I am not going to give you the entire history of what's happened at Starbreeze, again. If you want that kind of stuff, but a little more condensed, you can kindly refer to my 12 years of Payday, why you should embrace the original video. It kinda sucks, but I'm also a bit proud of it. Additionally, the discussion around Payday 3 is dead, Payday 3 is so over, Starbreeze is so done, is incredibly annoying and oversaturated at this point. I want to respect your time, so I'll get straight to the point. Short and simple. Most of what's wrong with the game was a long time coming, way before Payday 3 even started development. And the players are partially at fault, not just the developers. The average consumer knows what they want, but they sometimes have trouble putting it into words. Because of that, a lot of stuff can get lost in translation. Something about a game might feel off, and no one can quite tell you why. Payday 2 has attracted a lot of younger players, not just in recent times, even going as far back as 2014. When I first got into the game, I was 14 years old. I didn't know what set the game apart from its competitors. I just knew it was the funny clown game with the shooting and the cool masks. That being said, it's not like most of the studio now working on Payday 3 wasn't around when Payday the Heist was made, and that Payday 2's later success could mostly be attributed to its solid foundation that it was built on top of. They are mostly on the outside looking in. Asking players what they want from Payday will give you the result that I pretty much mentioned earlier. The funny clown game with the shooting of the cool masks.
I wouldn't make fun of any
Oh,
other
for fuck's sake!
I mean, what's the other one that does?
Now, hear me out. Before you go boosting my metrics by leaving a hateful comment, I'll talk a little bit more about it. Let's take a look at the Payday 2 and Payday 3 store pages. Payday 2 is an action-packed 4-player co-op shooter that once again lets gamers don the masks of the original Payday crew, Dallas Hawks and Wolf in Chains, as they descend on Washington DC for an epic crime spree. Payday 3 is the much-anticipated sequel to one of the most popular co-op shooters ever. Since its release, Payday players have been reveling in the thrill of perfectly planned and executed heist. That's what makes Payday a high-octane co-op FPS experience without equal. The word co-op is used in both. It's even used twice on Payday 3's store page. Notice how... No, bad joke. That being said, Payday 2 doesn't have a dedicated PS5 version. It's just backwards compatibility PS4 Crime Wave Edition. Curious. Back on topic. The bigger point I want to make is, current Payday 2 is barely a co-op shooter anymore. The cooperative gameplay boils down to running around, killing the same enemies as 3 other players on the same map, while occasionally helping each other up and dropping a medic bag before the level 59 Delos goes into custody. It has become incredibly fast and mindless, with tons of insta-kill power creep weaponry, an absurd amount of enemy spawns, and perk decks that trivialize the entire gameplay loop. If anything, Payday 2 is a horde shooter, and not a co-op shooter. There is a distinction between co-op shooters and horde shooters. Cooperative gameplay can exist within a horde shooter, but usually boils down to killing a lot of the same enemies, while the rest of the gameplay gets kinda pushed into the background. Something like World War Z comes to mind, or as a matter of fact, the hollow shell of a game that is back for blood. To me, something had gone missing in Payday 2 since about sometime around 2016. I know, old head screams at son for the gajillionth time, but I genuinely mean it. With Payday 3, everyone working on the game wanted a fresh new start. And since I used to love the franchise at one point, I was also willing to give it another shot. Immediately from the beta, it became apparent that the major focus shifted from specifically the co-op elements to instead the customization and small power trips given to the individual players, as well as little sprinkles of general mechanical overhauls in the form of streamlining. The skill system was more or less dumbed down and simplified, with perk decks entirely missing, whilst still trying to inject the incredibly annoying buff system, which is the big kicker here. It ultimately was supposed to introduce some kind of artificial flow into the gameplay, encouraging and rewarding the player for staying in the fight by giving them extra movement speed, damage buffs, and damage resistance for as long as they were able to uphold them. Except, some of these were also necessary to a handful of skills that you picked prior to loading to the heist. Look, I'm not even going to mention the fact that a couple of those skills should be base kit, or the fact that gaining a buff doesn't refresh it in gameplay. Tangent aside, this is my bigger point if you still haven't picked up on it. When interviewed, the developers admitted that they wanted to strike a balance between Payday 2 and Payday the Heist, trying to tone down the wacky from the second game, while still trying to be a bit more casual than the first game. They kinda achieved this. Except, now this game is just sitting in this limbo where it's slightly better than Payday 2, from a technical standpoint, whilst falling flat in the gameplay department compared to the game that started it all. Also, entirely unrelated, did you ever have one of those moments where you carried a couple of newcomers who haven't really played the game as much as you have before? Do people still do that? Let me know in the comments below. If we then take a look at the buff system and how the skills work, we very quickly come to the realization that the idea was to let the player power trip on their own, with the very rare skill that makes things such as helping another player up quicker. For me personally, the worst thing is that stuff like Inspire Basic just doesn't exist anymore. A movement speed bonus by shouting at someone is such an underutilized feature that could make for nice little moments, but alas, it's lacking, and there is really nothing to make up for it. Payday the Heist was more about team composition and playing together. Payday 2 already shifted more towards the direction of making players extremely strong and standing out against the masses of cops. But that game still had a curve in which you started out weak and broke before painfully climbing your way to the top, becoming the criminal mastermind. Remember how bad Payday 2's early leveling was? And how it was only this bad to make up for the lack of content? Sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? Anyway, Payday 2 still stood tall with its co-operative elements. You were usually forced to defend an objective together with your friends, which is a cheap way of encouraging holding out and sticking close together. Payday 3 wanted to do away with the drills and the like, but managed to go the complete opposite other way with the circles and stuff like on 99 Boxes and Golden Shark. A lot of this lack of proper co-op gameplay in Payday 3 is down to the skills. I've talked about this before. I'm a strong believer that the entire skill system needs an overhaul, and that skill combos such as ammo funnel and replenish should require more skill points, as it's simply too overpowered to exist as it is. Instead, the game should force the player to make a choice between picking this blatantly overpowered skill combo or saving the points for other equally as important things, which help the team instead of turning every player into a ruthless killing machine. With everything I just mentioned, the skills, the buffs, how the game promotes the individual player sticking out rather than working together as a team, we still manage to completely undermine everything with the armor system. It unnecessarily punishes you for being in combat due to the simple lack of damage grace in the game with hit scan enemies, a limited armor and health resource, and no play it safe early extraction option. At launch, if you didn't have an armor bag and your last plate broke, you were dead. You were stuck in a death spiral. This, paired with making custody more of a slap on the wrist on the highest difficulties by letting you respawn after 3 minutes anyway, made for an incredibly vapid, forgettable, and low-stakes gameplay loop. There simply is, and was, no thrill. I've asked some other people in a community DM.
That's modworkshop.net, folks!
and what they thought needed to change before they were willing to give Payday 3 another shot. Here's what they said. Crumb, who is someone that I talk to occasionally, wants a story reattempt, base game weapon buffs, and an entire skill overhaul. Deptoshi wants a skill overhaul, because most of the skills are uninspired and unfinished. A weapons overhaul, because right now, basically none of them really stick out outside of the DLC weapons. And an enemy overhaul, because the enemies are more brain dead than an ammo funnel and replenish user. Puro Video wrote a bit more. If you want to read through everything, you can pause it. I'm just going to mention the very basics. Making enemies more interesting to shoot at, so sort of kind of asking for an enemy overhaul. A skills overhaul, and lastly, some kind of surprise. Which, honestly, yeah, I feel that. Looking at this, it's kind of extremely apparent that the very core of the game seems kind of flawed. It's almost as if the game has no strength that it can flex outside of the new fancy engine, which the developers fail to properly utilize anyway. There's also the point of money not amounting to anything. When you pick up loose cash or secure a bag, you don't get a notification for how much you've actually stolen until you ultimately finish the heist. It's just so weird because it doesn't feel like the heist you're doing is for the money, despite the name of the game being Payday 3. The icing on the cake for all of this is just the lack of communication between players, not just between the community and the developers, even though that's also an incredibly huge problem. The voice wheel is just not enough, and pinging things doesn't actually ping them. There is a mechanic here that simply isn't utilized properly, and because gamers can be quite antisocial in public scenarios, you'd barely see any randoms coming together for more than one heist anyway. The new server browser hasn't changed that either, since the foundation, which the previous two games in the franchise did have, just wasn't there, and has just been hastily put on top of the already crumbling structure of Payday 3. Anyway, remember what I said earlier? The part about identity? It's just such a big term, isn't it? We all identify with something. We have our own identity, and we all want to be respected for it, for what we are. And sometimes we look for some kind of representation in media that we enjoy, as a part of the escapism that we all seek. That's something that anyone should be able to respect, understand, and something that any person with a working brain should be able to grasp as a concept. This isn't politics, this is basic human decency. If you get upset at this concept, fuck off and should be understandable enough, right? Part of the greater emphasis on identity in Payday started happening with all the tools they started handing out to the players to stick out. In the first game, it was just the masks, and the character of choice. In the second game, you had visible weapon attachments in third person. Then later, more characters. They introduced more suits, then gloves, joint stingers, skins, weapon colors. Most of these were added later on, when the core foundation of the game, as in the actual gameplay, was already figured out and just being improved upon. Improved is being very generous here, considering the game's just gotten worse. In Payday 3, this was all expected at launch, and while most of it did, a few extra things didn't make the cut, such as a scrapped suit color customization mechanic, for example. In theory, allowing greater customization and in turn a little self-insertion is not a bad thing. Players absolutely adore injecting a part of themselves into a game or a character, and expressing themselves in many different ways. Look at any game with a character creator. But in doing so, you usually have to cut a few corners. A game like Baldur's Gate 3 allows your character to become a bigger part of the gigantic living game world with tons of customization and a ton of different dialogue options and paths. It's the very concept of D&D put into a game, and it's executed almost flawlessly. There's a reason it's such a well-regarded game with extremely memorable characters and incredible writing. For games such as shooters specifically, however, it's usually a bit more difficult. Either you go with the silent protagonist, who you can fill the blanks in for, or a generic voiced henchman, as is the case for the Helldivers, which are defined by the bigger thing that they come together under, as the Helldivers. Then there's also the unvoiced generic henchman character, Fallout New Vegas, Oblivion. These games kind of take the Baldur's Gate approach, but limit you, maybe because of technical reasons or because of story reasons. But not every game tries to go for the grander immersive world and instead tries to do something a lot simpler. Sometimes less is simply more. In that case, having a small but diverse cast allows people to pick their favorites. That diverse cast consisting of a Brit, a Swede, and 2 Americans. Not much choice, but that's simply not inherently necessary if these characters manage to stand out on their own and fit into their respective world they're in, and most importantly interact with their world and each other in a way that's memorable and natural. Payday was never a huge open-ended game, even though Payday 2 was supposed to be an open world. But that's entirely besides the point. It was smaller and wanted to craft smaller story set pieces that tried to put 4 dudes and their operator on the phone into crazy situations and high-stakes shootouts. And it delivered. As I said, less is more. People love to point out the pain of the heist, heister interactions, and how they make every heist feel lively and immersive.
Just want some ammo. Oh, fuck, Cloaker. Wow, he's breaking his spine.
I saw that.
You gonna kill that guy?
You're just gonna...
You gonna kill that Cloaker?
Once you add even more characters to the mix, however, it becomes kind of a mess to record additional voiceover for everything you're going to add and everyone you haven't added yet. This in turn brings me to Payday 3 and how badly written every character is. I am a Clover main. I prefer amalgamations of smoke along and initial release lines in Payday 2 more than the Payday 3 lines. I just can't get over her generic mission item is broken line. The thingy stopped doing its thingy. As for the greater reason for all of this, I can only point and make assumptions. In my mind, it's about the staff, and how few people are left who know what Payday is and was about. What supports my theory is the fact that Diamond District is the most Payday-feeling heist in the game right now. And it was made by a major figure who worked on Payday in the past, as well as Raid World War II, Ilya Petrusic. There's also Andreas Pellinger, who is a great guy and I trust him to know what he's doing, but he's only temporarily in a leading position. As for Almir, he is the wholesome Chungus 100 guy, but I don't trust a PR person who's incredibly awkward on camera to know what the game he's been associated with for over 10 years to actually be about. If anything, I credit the Unfunny Spoon and OnlyFans model sponsored streams to him. Lastly, mentioning Mio might put me on the fire here, but I think it's important to point this out as a closing thought of sorts. Most of Mio's experience prior to their first project on a Starbreeze, Overkill's The Walking Dead, was actually designing puzzles for hidden object games. This is a questionable step, but we all have to start somewhere, and we all eventually move up to something bigger. Overkill's The Walking Dead was flawed, and I even made a video about that ages ago now, where I was highly critical of the game. That being said, you cannot attribute all the bad decisions to one person only. There's always a team working together on something. It probably was a good environment for Mia to get experience in though. I absolutely do not condone the cyberbullying that happened. The entire Mia must go push on the subreddit and on Twitter was awful. It proves my bigger point of the community being quite antisocial, extremely young, and incredibly toxic. At the same time, I also do think that Mia does not know how to interact with the community. For Overkill's The Walking Dead, there was little interaction. Nowadays, everything and everyone is a lot more connected. In turn, people demand more information from developers. While Starbreeze refused to answer, Mia wanted to give people the answers that they wanted. But NDAs, manipulative language from certain people in the community, and an incredibly stubborn attitude from Mia themselves made it difficult for any of this to end well. They are not the problem. I am incredibly disappointed that Starbreeze basically said cyberbullying works by not properly acknowledging anything after everything that had happened. They used to in the past, and even called out the language used by a level designer, who got upset at the comments from people asking for console updates. As a final note, here's a short summary of the bullet points I've used to pinpoint down exactly what's wrong with Payday 3 for me. The weapons, the weapon modding in particular, but also the balance. The enemies, their design and the balance. The levels, their mission structure and the running around them. The characters, the writing, the lack of in-heist dialogue, and the lack of natural personality. The community, more specifically the lack thereof, and the lack of proper online lobbies that stick together. The identity of the game, or rather how it's copying trends and in turn sacrifices a lot of its own recognizability, and most importantly, the lack of proper cooperative gameplay in my cooperative shooter. The biggest reason of them all. Everything feels disconnected, everything feels like an attempt at being Payday again, rather than carrying the torch, so to speak.
Buy it now.
To me, Payday 3 is like that cheap cash-in sequel to my favorite movie. Like that song from the artist that I used to love, which I simply can't vibe with anymore. Like the piece of niche artwork from the artist that I followed, which branched out and no longer does things that capture me. It's the game that carries a title that I remember, but it just doesn't live up to its name. If you liked this video, please do me a big favor and leave an even bigger one. A like and a subscription to the channel would make me happy. Thank you for watching my dumb queer slot video, and take care.